This is the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. It is not a very large building, and it's essentially in the middle of nowhere. The nearest notable city is Albany, over 70 miles away by car, and calling Albany notable is generous. Yet, it houses over 150 years of baseball history within its walls. Some of the game's most important artifacts are displayed across the hall's 3 floors of exhibit space, and the plaque gallery honors the game's most important players, managers, executives, pioneers, and umpires. Well, most of the game's most important players. Let's play a game. I'm going to show you some key stats from 2 players, one of whom is currently a Hall of Famer, and one of whom is not. You have to guess which player is in the Hall of Fame. Simple enough, right? Let's start with 2 pitchers. Can you guess which one is the Hall of Famer? If you guess the pitcher on the right, you're wrong. On the right is Luis Tiant, and on the left is Hall of Famer Jesse Haynes. Okay, round 2. Guess which one of these center fielders is in the Hall of Fame. Obviously, the player on the left is Hall of Famer Lloyd Wainer, while the player on the right is non-Hall of Famer Kenny Lofton. Okay, one more round. How about this one? Yeah, I know, steroids. We'll get to that, don't you worry. Honestly, these one-to-one comparisons are a bit of a silly exercise. They're popular on social media because they catch your attention and they're easy to understand, but there are far more interesting conversations to be had about the Hall of Fame that get obscured when we choose to focus only on a handful of players. I plan to use this video to have those more interesting conversations. And a quick note before we start. Even though I am going to be very critical of it in this video, I do love the Hall of Fame. I've been there 3 times. It's just that it has some major problems, specifically as it pertains to the induction of players as Hall of Famers. Let's talk about those problems. And then, let's try to fix them. As of the recording of this video in December 2025, there are 352 elected members of the Baseball Hall of Fame. By the time this video comes out though, I suspect that Carlos Beltran and Andruw Jones will increase that number to 354. 40 of those 352 members were inducted as executives or pioneers, 23 of them were inducted as managers, 10 of them were inducted as umpires, and the remaining 279 were inducted as players. Of those 279 players, 28 of them played most or all of their career in the Negro Leagues, and 251 of them played primarily in the National League, American League, National Association, or American Association. And of those 251 players, I would say that there are at least 20 that almost everyone would agree do not belong in the Hall of Fame. There are another 40 or so that a lot of people would say do not belong, though their cases are a bit more debatable. On the other hand, there's quite a few players that most would agree do belong in the Hall of Fame, yet those players are still stuck on the outside looking in. There are 29 players that primarily played right field in the Hall of Fame, but only 17 players that primarily played third base. There are more players that played in the 1920s in the Hall of Fame than any other decade, despite the fact that there were only 16 teams in the 1920s between the American League and the National League. Only 3 players that played more than 2 seasons in the 1870s have been inducted into the Hall of Fame as players. How did we get here? How did we end up with such an unbalanced, inconsistent mess? The first elections for the Hall of Fame were held in 1936. Much like modern Hall of Fame voting, there were 2 separate votes that year. 226 BBWAA writers voted for players whose contributions to baseball came after 1900, while a Veterans Committee, made up of 78 members with exceptional knowledge of 19th century baseball, voted for players whose contributions to baseball came prior to 1900. Both groups of voters were instructed to vote for 10 candidates. Not up to 10 candidates, but exactly 10 candidates. Candidates that received at least 75% of the vote in either election would be inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1939, when the Cooperstown building would open its doors. However, the voters were not given a standard list of players, managers, pioneers, and executives to pick from. Their ballot came with a list of suggested individuals, which surely influenced voters, but they were free to write in anybody that they wished. The only rule was the 1900 boundary, and even that was poorly defined. What about players whose careers started in the 19th century and continued into the 20th century? Cy Young, for example, played 10 seasons in the 19th century and 12 seasons in the 20th century. Which group of voters was supposed to consider him? He was initially listed as a suggestion on the BBWAA ballot, but was later also listed as a suggestion on the Veterans Committee ballot. The question of which group was supposed to vote for him was never answered, and as a result, Cy Young received 49.1% of votes on the writer's ballot and 41.7% of votes on the Veterans Committee ballot. Presumably, the majority of those who did not vote for him thought his candidacy belonged to the other group of voters. There also wasn't a rule about how long a player had to be retired for, or even if he had to be retired at all. 9 active players received votes, and all 9 of them were actually on the list of suggested players that came with the ballot. Another interesting tidbit is that players who were banned from baseball were eligible to be voted into the Hall of Fame in 1936, and Shoeless Joe Jackson, who was banned by Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis for his alleged involvement in the 1919 Black Sox scandal, received 2 votes. Despite the lack of clarity, a group of 5 superb players managed to receive over 75% of the vote on the writer's ballot: Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, Honus Wagner, Christy Mathewson, and Walter Johnson. These 5 players would make up the Hall of Fame's inaugural class. They would not be joined by any 19th century players, as the Veterans Committee failed to elect a single candidate in 1936. In addition to the confusion over who the voters could and could not vote for, the Hall also decided that they actually only wanted the VC voters to have 5 votes, not 10. However, this decision was made after many voters had already cast their ballots. In order to resolve this, every vote on a ballot that listed 10 players was counted as a half of a vote, rather than a full vote. I'm not sure what kind of math genius came up with this brilliant idea, but if the majority of ballots were counted as half votes rather than full votes, it would be impossible for any player to get 75% of the votes, even if that player was listed on every single ballot. Cap Anson and Buck Ewing led the pack with 50.6% of the vote, which is honestly quite an impressive number considering the circumstances. There were obviously some pretty major flaws with the Hall of Fame election process from the beginning, but perhaps that's to be expected. Some trial and error is required to work out the kinks. Surely, with a few small tweaks, they were able to fix the problems, and then for the next 80 or so years, everything went smoothly. Yeah, no, that's not what happened. The subsequent years were about as smooth as Adam Levine's pickup lines. In fact, you could argue that 1936 was one of the best years of Hall of Fame voting, at least from an outcome perspective. 5 players were elected, more than are elected most years, and they were among the best players eligible. No, it gets way, way worse than 1936. Throughout its history, Hall of Fame elections were like the Hydra. Cut off one of the problems, and 2, or 3, or 10 more grow in its place. Before we continue our discussion of the Hall of Fame, I have a quick announcement to make. I started a Patreon, and I also turned on memberships here on my YouTube channel. I'm never going to put my main content behind a paywall, but for anyone that enjoys my videos and wants to support me, both Patreon and YouTube memberships are a great way to do so. Members will get access to my Hall of Fame spreadsheet, which contains stats for over 630 players, and was a tool that helped me tremendously when putting together my personal Hall of Fame that I'll discuss at the end of this video. The spreadsheet also allows you to sort by a variety of different stats, and it also contains 37 different tabs that you can filter by position, decade, or my opinion of their Hall of Fame worthiness. I will also post additional members-only content on occasion. I definitely plan to make some short videos discussing Hall of Fame cases for certain players, and I may also do some trivia stuff or short videos on topics that aren't deep enough for a full video. You can become a member on YouTube by clicking the join button below, and the link to my Patreon is in the description. Memberships cost $5 per month on both platforms. Thank you guys, and let's get back to discussing the Hall of Fame. Instead of admitting their mathematical error, the Hall placed the blame on the Veterans Committee for failing to elect anyone in 1936, and in 1937, the Veterans Committee was replaced by the Centennial Commission. Instead of voting on 19th century players, the Centennial Commission focused on managers and executives. The 19th century players would have to wait for their chance. The Centennial Commission was also composed of fewer members than the Veterans Committee. The 1936 VC had 78 members, but the 1937 Centennial Commission had only 6 members, all of whom were current or former executives in charge of various major and minor leagues. The BBWAA election, on the other hand, was held in largely the same manner as the previous year. There were 2 notable changes, however. Firstly, the writers were instructed not to vote for active players. Secondly, and more consequently, there was no list of suggested players included with the ballot. On one hand, this was a good change. The voters were able to think more freely without being influenced by suggestions from others. On the other hand, it caused the number of players receiving votes to jump from 47 to 113. Let's take a look at some of the players that received Hall of Fame votes in 1937, shall we? Bill Sissel received a vote, or Sissel, I'm not really sure. He had a career 73 OPS plus and 2.7 RWAR in just 9 seasons as a big leaguer. The enduring rule that a player must have played a minimum of 10 seasons to be eligible for the Hall of Fame was in place at that time, but apparently Sissel's voter didn't get the memo. Sissel was also an active player in 1937, meaning that his voter broke 2 separate rules by voting for him. Bugs Raymond received a vote. He played 6 seasons, only 2 of which were full seasons. Marty Bergen received 2 votes. He played 344 career games across 4 seasons. His career ended early not due to injury, but due to him killing his wife and 2 children and then himself. He also played entirely in the 19th century, meaning that he wasn't even supposed to be eligible for the BBWAA election, even if he had played 10 seasons. There are countless other examples, but I think you get the idea. Clearly, it was not a great idea to give the writers free rein. 2 writers left at least one of these players off of their ballots in order to vote for a murderer that played 4 seasons. In 1938, elections were conducted the same way as 1937, and the problems with the system became even more apparent. 120 players received votes from writers, and only one, Grover Alexander, received a large enough share of the vote to make the Hall. There was also no way for 19th century players to make the Hall of Fame, since the Veterans Committee was abandoned and the Centennial Commission was focused on managers, pioneers, and executives. This issue was resolved in 1939, but the way in which it was resolved was rather dubious. In 1939, the Centennial Commission was replaced by the Old Timers Committee, which was made up of only 3 members: Commissioner of Baseball Kennesaw Mountain Landis, National League President Ford Frick, and American League President Will Harridge. Instead of a committee of 78 experts, as was originally planned, the first 19th century players to be elected to the Hall of Fame were chosen by only 3 men. And these 3 men were not historians, but executives. The Baseball Hall of Fame opened in Cooperstown in the summer of 1939, and all of the players, managers, executives, and pioneers that had been elected over the past few years were officially inducted. The Hall was evidently satisfied with its membership, as it was announced that voting would no longer be held annually, but every 3 years instead. This was, frankly, a terrible decision. There was already a huge backlog of candidates, and voting only once every 3 years would dramatically compound this issue. Infrequent voting is a double whammy for candidates. Not only do they have fewer chances to receive votes, but there are also a higher number of eligible candidates to compete with. In other words, less frequent voting means fewer people being inducted not only because of the years off, but also because it is harder for anyone to reach 75% in the years that there are elections. The writers also weren't just voting for players when the next election was held in 1942. Miller Huggins received the 5th most votes in 1942, and Wilbert Robinson received the 8th most. Huggins and Robinson were managers. Rogers Hornsby was the only individual to be elected in 1942. 19th century players were once again ignored, as there was no committee vote. Another 2 years passed without an election. In 1945, no players were elected to the Hall of Fame by the BBWAA. 7 individuals received over 50% of the vote, and 27 individuals received over 10% of the vote, but none of them received the 75% of the vote needed for induction. The backlog was simply too big. There were too many qualified players and managers for voters to choose from, which made it incredibly difficult for voters to come to any kind of consensus. In an attempt to resolve the backlog issue, and in response to growing criticism about the Hall ignoring 19th century players, the Old Timers Committee, now made up of 7 members, reconvened in 1945 to elect 10 individuals. 10 wasn't the number that they settled on after discussing the merits of each candidate, though. They decided beforehand that exactly 10 candidates would be chosen. In order to meet this quota, the standards had to be lowered. The Old Timers Committee did achieve its goal. More 19th century players were elected, and the oversaturation of talent on the BBWAA ballot was relieved a bit. The consequence of their 10-member quota, though, was that the average level of greatness among Hall of Fame players decreased dramatically, as the Hall inducted players that were far weaker than those in the classes before them. This would become a theme of the Hall of Fame voting process. Every attempt to fix a problem would cause problems of its own. It also established another theme. While the writers were generally careful in who they voted for and attempted to maintain a high standard, their authority would continually be undermined by committees made up of comparatively minuscule numbers of people. Due to the slow pace of elections by the BBWAA, Hall of Fame voting returned to being an annual process in 1946, and the voting process was changed. The writers would vote as normal, instructed to vote for 10 players among any retired player or manager that was active in the 20th century, But this initial vote would not determine whether or not candidates are elected. Instead, the top 20 vote-getters would be put on a final ballot, and they would need to receive 75% of the vote on the final ballot to be elected. The hope was that, with the return to annual voting, with the new final ballot method, and with 9 players and 1 manager removed from contention by the Old Timers Committee the previous year, the BBWAA would be able to elect 5 new Hall of Fame members in 1946. However, the Hall of Fame again made it evident that it did not have any mathematicians on its staff, as the writers were allowed to vote for only 5 candidates on the final ballot, as opposed to the 10 votes on the initial ballot. Apparently, no one realized that if 10 votes per writer wasn't enough for any candidates to reach 75%, then 5 votes per writer would make it even less likely. As anyone with even a basic understanding of math should have seen coming, every single candidate that appeared on the final ballot received a lesser percentage of the vote than he did on the initial ballot. Needless to say, no one was elected to the Hall of Fame by the BBWAA in 1946. Not to worry though, the Old Timers Committee came to the rescue again, this time electing 10 players and 1 executive. The committee made some good selections, such as pitcher Eddie Plank. The committee also made some awful selections, such as outfielder Tommy McCarthy. Over 50% of all Hall of Famers had now been selected by small committees made up of fewer than 10 people, most of whom were executives. The BBWAA was too divided to elect anyone, and the Old Timers Committee was seemingly picking names out of a hat just to have players to induct. The system was broken. The Hall was aware that its system wasn't working, so it instituted even more changes in 1947. Firstly, the 2-step voting process was eliminated due to its obvious failure the previous year. The election process from past years was reinstated, but in the event that no candidates received 75% of the vote, a runoff ballot featuring the top 20 vote-getters would be used to elect the 1 player that received the most votes in the runoff, regardless of the vote percentage. Secondly, in order to decrease the number of eligible players that the writers could vote for, the first limit on the number of years of eligibility that a candidate had was introduced. Now, players only had 25 years of eligibility, starting with the year of their retirement. This made any player that had retired prior to 1922 ineligible for the 1947 vote. This change achieved its intended outcome, as only 39 players received votes in 1947 and 4 players were elected. The runoff vote was not needed. There were no selections made by the Old Timers Committee in 1947, which was both a good and bad change. It was good because the Old Timers Committee had proven that they suck at selecting Hall of Famers. It was bad because there was now no way for players that retired prior to 1922 to be elected to the Hall of Fame. Once again, one problem was solved, but the solution created a new problem. The election process remained the same in 1948, the first time since voting began in 1936 that the rules had remained the same in consecutive years. The same system was used in 1949 as well, though the Old Timers Committee decided to return and select 2 players for the Hall. The Old Timers Committee still had no formal system in place regarding how they would select players or how often they would select players. The members of the committee simply did whatever they felt like doing. They would not select any more players until 1953. In 1950, the runoff ballot was eliminated, and for the first time, except for the years in which no election took place, the Hall of Fame did not elect any new members. While limiting eligibility to 25 years certainly helped with the oversaturation of talented players for the writers to choose from, it proved to be only a temporary fix. In 1950, 100 different players received Hall of Fame votes, but even all-time greats like Mel Ott and Jimmy Fox were unable to surpass 75% of the vote. For the next few years, the election process did not change. It was working decently well, as a few players were elected, and they were all deserving of Hall of Fame status. But these 2 big issues persisted. Many deserving players were unable to reach 75% on the BBWAA ballot due to the high number of talented players, and the players that had retired more than 25 years ago were completely ignored. In 1953, the Old Timers Committee was replaced by the Veterans Committee. Unlike the original Veterans Committee of 1936, though, which was made up of 78 voting members, this new Veterans Committee was made up of only 11 members, and, like the Old Timers Committee, they met and selected players behind closed doors. Unlike the Old Timers Committee, though, the Veterans Committee actually had a system in place for how often they would select players, and it was decided that the interval would be every other year. The VC selected 6 new Hall of Famers in 1953. 2 pioneers/executives, 2 umpires, and 2 players, Charles Bender and Bobby Wallace. Wallace's election serves as an example of what would become a major issue with the Veterans Committee: cronyism. In his video on Wallace, Foolish Baseball points out that Wallace had connections to many members of the Veterans Committee, including Branch Rickey and Warren Giles. While there's no definitive proof that this is the reason that Wallace was selected by the committee, it is an inherent risk when allowing a committee made up of so few people to have so much power. BBWAA voting underwent a series of changes throughout the next decade, as viewers of my Archivon video may know. In 1954, the 5-year waiting period, which still exists today, was introduced. This helped reduce the number of eligible players. However, the effects were completely undone the following year, as the eligibility window was extended in 1955 to allow players that had been retired for a maximum of 30 years, rather than 25 years. Overall, though, things were going alright. The writers elected 3 players of varying merit in 1954, 4 players, all of pretty high merit in 1955, and another 2 pretty deserving players in 1956. For the first time since 1936, the writers were actually able to come to enough of a consensus to elect a decent number of players year after year. The Veterans Committee still wasn't perfect, but overall, the system was finally working pretty well. And then they ruined it in 1957. After the 1956 vote, it was decided that the writers were actually too efficient at electing Hall of Famers. So instead of voting annually, the BBWAA votes would be held every other year, alternating with the Veterans Committee. The VC would meet in odd-numbered years, and the writers would vote in even-numbered years. In addition, writers were no longer required to vote for exactly 10 players. They were now permitted to vote for up to 10 players, with the option to vote for fewer candidates, or not at all, if they chose to do so. The effects were felt immediately. After the year off in 1957, the BBWAA failed to elect any players in 1958, and 154 players received at least 1 vote. It was the same story in 1960. 134 players received votes, but no player came even close to 75%. The Veterans Committee had slowed as well, selecting 1 player and 1 manager in 1957, 1 player in 1959, and 2 players in 1961. This was definitely preferable to the approach taken by the Old Timers Committee, but there were still plenty of legends from baseball's early days, such as John Clarkson, Tim Keefe, Pud Galvin, Roger Connor, John Ward, George Davis, and Ross Barnes, that were waiting to take their rightful place in Cooperstown. Unfortunately, Ross Barnes is still waiting to this day. The Veterans Committee switched back to meeting annually after 1961, so maybe that would help. Instead of focusing on these 19th century players, though, the Veterans Committee began to select players that had just fallen off the writers' ballot a few years prior. In 1958, Max Carey received 51.1% of the vote in his final year of eligibility on the writers' ballot. In 1961, he was one of the 2 players elected to the Hall of Fame by the Veterans Committee. In 1960, Ed Roush received 54.3% of the BBWAA vote in his final year of eligibility. He was the only player selected for the Hall of Fame by the VC in 1962, though a manager was also selected. Sam Rice and Eparixi fell off the writers' ballot in 1962, when they received 50.6% of the vote and 30.6% of the vote, respectively. Both men were put in the Hall by the Veterans Committee the very next year. The purpose of the Veterans Committee was to consider candidates that were not eligible for the BBWAA election, so in a way you could say that the committee was doing its job. However, I don't think the intention was for the committee to immediately enshrine all of the players that the writers had just decided weren't good enough. Why even have the BBWAA vote in that case? The runoff vote was reintroduced in 1962, but it wasn't needed that year, as Bob Feller and Jackie Robinson both received over 75% of the vote in their first years of eligibility. In 1964, the eligibility period for the writers' ballot was reduced from 30 years after retirement to 20 years after retirement. This meant that players now only had 15 years of eligibility after the 5-year waiting period. But because elections were held every other year, players would only have a maximum of 8 chances to be elected to the Hall by the BBWAA. This would certainly reduce the number of eligible players, but it would undoubtedly also cause deserving players to slip through the cracks. And who would be responsible for catching those that slipped through? The Veterans Committee, made up of a few guys who may or may not have an agenda. Let's hope they continue to make decisions fairly and objectively. Despite 1967 being an odd-numbered year, there was a special BBWAA election due to some writers voting for ineligible players the prior year. Red Ruffing's last year of eligibility was supposed to be in 1966, but this special election gave him one final opportunity. And when no player reached 75%, Red Ruffing was elected to the Hall of Fame by receiving the highest share of the vote on the runoff ballot. Whether the special election was held with the intention of getting Ruffing in or not, his case serves as a great example of how the ever-changing election rules can impact who is enshrined in the Hall. Ruffing needed not only the special election, but also the runoff ballot rule in order to make it in. Without both of these, he would have had to wait a bit longer to get his plaque. And when I say a bit longer, I mean like a year or two, given the recent tendencies of the Veterans Committee. Speaking of the Veterans Committee, it added a new member in 1967, Hall of Fame second baseman Frankie Frisch. Many members had come and gone from the VC over the years, but the addition of Frisch would undoubtedly prove to be the most consequential. He would quickly become chairman and exert his influence over the rest of the committee. In 1967, the Veterans Committee selected executive Branch Rickey, most famous for signing Jackie Robinson, and player Lloyd Waner, most famous for not being as good at baseball as his brother Paul was. Waner was likely the second or third worst player in the Hall of Fame at that point in time. In 1968, with the Hall still struggling to figure out how to find a balanced election system, BBWAA voting returned to being an annual event, and the runoff ballot was once again eliminated. The Hall also implemented perhaps the most revolutionary change to date, the Screening Committee. The days of 100+ players receiving votes were over. The Screening Committee, which still exists today, would provide a set ballot of players for the writers to vote on. The Screening Committee did prevent the writers from spreading their votes thin, and it did help deserving candidates reach the 75% threshold. But, of course, every solution comes with its own set of issues. Now there was yet another small committee with the power to influence the election results, and potentially prevent a deserving player from even having the chance to be voted on. And this isn't just a hypothetical issue, it's happened. The most egregious example is 1985, when the Screening Committee chose not to include Willie Davis on the Hall of Fame ballot. While I'm not sure if Willie Davis should be a Hall of Famer, he certainly has a legitimate case. Even if you ignore his 60.8 RWAR, it's completely preposterous to not even allow the writers to vote in a guy with over 2,500 career hits. Thank God the Screening Committee put Ed Kranepool on the ballot that year though, he definitely deserved consideration. The Frisch-led Veteran Committee selected 2 players in 1968, and another 2 in 1969. One of the 2 players each year was a solid choice, and the other one each year was questionable. In 1970 though, the VC went fully off the rails. The committee selected executive Ford Frick and 2 players, Earl Combs and Jesse Haynes. Combs wasn't a great selection. His career was short, and he was a very good but not exceptional player. He never even reached 20% of the vote on the BBWAA ballot. The real head-scratcher, though, was Jesse Haynes. Haynes wasn't really on anyone's radar. He maxed out at 8.3% of the BBWAA vote, and he was never a star during his career. He clearly isn't a deserving Hall of Famer by modern metrics, such as ERA+ or WAR, and he wasn't a Hall of Famer by the more traditional metrics that were common in 1970 either, such as ERA, strikeouts, or wins. He was, however, teammates with Frankie Frisch for 11 seasons on the St. Louis Cardinals. Not only was Frisch the most influential member of the Veterans Committee in 1970, the committee also consisted of a number of individuals that were predisposed to back him up. Fred Lieb was a member of the Veterans Committee in 1970. Lieb spent a large portion of his career as a sports writer in New York, covering the Yankees, Dodgers, and the team that Frisch spent the first 8 years of his career with, the New York Giants. Lieb covered the Giants while Frisch was on the team. J. Roy Stockton was also on the committee. Stockton was a writer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from 1918 to 1958, where he covered, you guessed it, the St. Louis Cardinals. He covered the Cardinals for the entirety of Frisch's tenure with the team, and Haynes' tenure as well, for that matter. Frisch's influence grew in 1971, when he gained another lackey on the Veterans Committee, Hall of Fame first baseman Bill Terry, who was teammates with Frisch for 4 seasons in New York. Waite Hoyt also joined the VC that year, only 2 years after Frisch and company had put him in the Hall of Fame. Surely there was pressure for him to follow along with the people that had just given him his Hall of Fame plaque. The committee elected 7 individuals in 1971, the most in its history. Among them was 1 executive, 3 players that are borderline at best, and 3 players that are absolutely not Hall of Fame material. The 3 players in the latter category were Chick Hafey, Dave Bancroft, and Rube Marquard. Hafey was teammates with Frisch for 5 seasons in St. Louis, Bancroft was teammates with Frisch for 4 seasons in New York, and Marquardt was never teammates with Frisch, but he played for the Giants shortly before Frisch arrived. None of these three players received significant support from the writers during their BBWAA ballot eligibility. Frisch was back at it again in 1972. His Veterans Committee selected Ross Youngs, who was teammates with Frisch for the entirety of Frisch's 8-year tenure in New York. Frankie Frisch died in 1973, but not before sneaking one more teammate into the Hall. In 1973, the Veterans Committee selected 1880s pitcher Mickey Welch and first baseman George High Pockets Kelly, who was teammates with Frisch on the Giants for 8 seasons. Kelly was likely the Frisch Committee's worst selection so far. The Veterans Committee sent 17 players to Cooperstown during Frisch's reign from 1967 to 1973. 7 of those 17 players played for either the Cardinals or the Giants. Goose Goslin, who was not a Cardinal or Giant, was worth the most career RWAR of the bunch with 66.0. 13 of the 17 players were worth fewer than 60 career RWAR, 10 of the 17 players were worth fewer than 50 career RWAR, and 7 of the 17 players were worth fewer than 40 career RWAR. Of all Hall of Famers inducted as players from 1936 to 1973, 7 of the bottom 10 players by RWAR were put into the Hall of Fame by Frankie Frisch's Veterans Committee. 5 of these players played for either the Giants or the Cardinals, and 4 of them were teammates with Frankie Frisch. Although Frisch died in 1973, his influence did not die with him. He had surely advocated for other teammates prior to his death, and his support for those players stuck with the other members of the committee after his passing. Fred Lee, Bill Terry, and Waite Hoyt remained on the committee after 1973, as did 2 more members who had joined over the past few years. Bob Broeg, who is a writer that spent 40 years covering the St. Louis Cardinals, and Stan Musial, who played his entire 22-year MLB career for the Cardinals, served as vice president of the Cardinals for 4 seasons, and served as general manager of the Cardinals for a season. Frisch himself was dead, but the Frisch-era Veterans Committee was very much alive. In 1974, the Veterans Committee selected 19th century slugger Sam Thompson and Cardinals first baseman and former Frisch teammate Jim Bottomley. In 1975, the committee selected 2 players, neither of whom were a Cardinal or a Giant. 1975 was the first year since 1969 that the Veterans Committee hadn't selected at least one player that played primarily for either the Cardinals or the Giants. In 1976, however, the committee selected 2 players, both of whom were New York Giants. One of these players was Roger Connor, a 19th century player that should have been inducted long ago. The other was Freddie Lindstrom, a teammate of both Frankie Frisch and Bill Terry, who became the 3rd worst player in the Hall by RWAR at the time of his induction. In addition to watering down the Hall with players that had no business being there, the Frisch-era selections also destroyed any desire that the Hall may have had of equally representing different eras of baseball. The Hall of Fame was now dominated by players that played in the 1920s. While the Veterans Committee was a disaster, the BBWAA elections seemed to be running fairly smoothly. The writers had elected an average of 1.4 players per year from 1968 to 1976. The screening committee seemed to fix the bottleneck by focusing the voters on only a select number of candidates. There was still the issue of the screening committee potentially leaving a deserving player off the ballot entirely, as well as the potential of a deserving player to slip through the cracks, but that's where the Veterans Committee was supposed to come in. The committee members just needed to get their acts together and vote for players whose qualifications came from how well they played rather than what team they played for. Instead, the members of the Veterans Committee continued to demonstrate that they were simply going to do whatever they pleased, as they put Addie Joss in the Hall of Fame in 1978. Addie Joss was not eligible for the Hall of Fame, as he only played 9 seasons in the big leagues. The Veterans Committee ignored this rule. To this day, Joss is the only non-Negro League Hall of Famer to be inducted as a player despite playing fewer than 10 seasons in the major leagues. In 1979, a new rule was added for the BBWAA elections. Now, the percentage of votes that a candidate receives would determine his eligibility in future elections. If a candidate receives more than 5% of the vote, they must appear on the ballot the next year. If a candidate receives fewer than 5% of the vote, they are removed from the ballot the next year. This rule is still in effect today. It was a logical change to make sure that the number of players on the ballot remains reasonable, but it had the potential to result in players that normally would have received support later in their candidacy falling off the ballot after only 1 year instead. And this did happen. In 1980, future Hall of Famer Ron Santo fell off the ballot in his first year of eligibility after receiving just 3.9% of the vote. Just 3 years later, future Hall of Famer Dick Allen also received fewer than 5% of the vote in his first year on the ballot. Interestingly, both men, along with a handful of others that had received fewer than 5% of the vote, were added back to the ballot in 1985 just because. The complete lack of consistency and ignoring of its own rules was very on brand for the Hall at this point. For the first time in its 50-year history, Hall of Fame voting stuck with the same rules and process for a substantial period of time, starting in 1979. The BBWAA was doing a pretty decent job of selecting 1 or 2 candidates every year, most of whom were deserving. The Veterans Committee was still an unpredictable mess, and giving the power to select players to such a small group of men was still a terrible decision, but at least the cronyism had died down a little bit. Except for when Ted Williams joined the Veterans Committee in 1986 and immediately got the committee to select his former teammate Bobby Doerr. The next rule change would come in 1991, when individuals who were banned from baseball were officially declared ineligible for the Hall of Fame. This rule was put in place specifically to prevent Pete Rose from being inducted, as other banned players, such as Joe Jackson, Eddie Seacott, and Jim Devlin, had received little to no support from either the BBWAA or the Veterans Committee, even without the rule. In 1999, limitations were finally placed on the Veterans Committee. In order to be eligible for election by the Veterans Committee, players must have either played prior to 1945, received at least 100 votes on the BBWAA ballot prior to 1991, or received at least 60% of the vote in a BBWAA ballot since 1991. These restrictions would last 3 years. They would be rescinded after the 2001 vote, when the Veterans Committee would finally experience an overhaul. After the 2001 vote, the old Veterans Committee, made up of 10 to 15 people who met and made decisions in secret, was abolished. The new Veterans Committee was actually the original Veterans Committee from 1936. Just like the BBWAA, the Veterans Committee would now consist of many members who would vote independently by mail for the candidates on a set ballot provided by the Hall. In order to determine who would appear on the ballot, a historical overview committee comprising 10 writers would nominate 200 players. Those nominations would then be reviewed by a group of 60 writers and a group of 6 Hall of Fame members. The writers would select 25 of the nominees to appear on the final ballot, and the Hall of Fame members would select 5 nominees, resulting in a maximum of 30 players on the ballot if there was no overlap between the selections of the 2 groups. Candidates would need 75% of the Veterans Committee vote to be elected to the Hall of Fame. The new Veterans Committee would consist of all living members of the Hall of Fame, recipients of the J.G. Taylor Spink Award, given out annually to a baseball writer, recipients of the Ford C. Frick Award, given out annually to a broadcaster, and members of the old Veterans Committee. The committee would vote every other year, rather than the annual meeting held by the old committee. The first election for the new Veterans Committee took place in 2003. 81 total ballots were cast, and no candidate received the 75% needed for induction. The committee voted again in 2005, and again, it elected no one. The committee voted for a third time in 2007, with a few small changes, and for the third time, it didn't elect a single candidate. The inability to elect any Hall of Famer was the reason why the large Veterans Committee was replaced with a much smaller committee after the 1936 vote. Now, the switch back to the 1936 system was causing the same problem. But was it really a problem this time? Look at the players they were voting on. Ron Santo is pretty clearly a deserving Hall of Famer in my opinion, but everyone else on this ballot is borderline at best. Is it really a bad thing that they didn't elect anyone in their first 3 attempts? The purpose of the Veterans Committee was to catch any deserving players that happen to slip through the cracks. If there aren't any deserving players to choose from, then wouldn't the desired outcome be for no one to be elected? Evidently, the Hall of Fame didn't see it that way. In 2009, the Veterans Committee was split into 2 separate elections for players. The regular group of 64 committee members would vote on players that were active only after 1942, while a separate panel of only 12 members, chosen by the Hall of Fame's Board of Directors, would vote on players that were active in 1942 or before. While the large committee failed to elect anyone for the 4th cycle in a row, the smaller panel elected Joe Gordon. Even more changes came in 2011. The Veterans Committee, as a single entity, was abolished, and replaced with multiple committees that focused on specific eras of baseball. Each era committee had only 16 members, who would vote on a small number of candidates provided by the Historical Overview Committee. This gave the Historical Overview Committee a lot of power. Because the ballots were so small, if there was a particular candidate or two that they favored, they could put that candidate up against weak competition and influence the election results. The era committees would alternate voting each year. The Expansion Era Committee went first in 2011, followed by the Golden Days Era Committee in 2012, and the Pre-Integration Era Committee in 2013. The cycle restarted with the Expansion Era Committee in 2014. In 2016, the system was tweaked. Instead of 3 committees, there were now 4. Early Baseball, Golden Days, Modern Baseball, and Today's Game. Someone please tell the Hall of Fame that the names of those last 2 committees are synonymous. In 2022, the system was tweaked again, and the 4 committees were condensed into just 2. The Contemporary Baseball Era Committee, which covers the years from 1980 to present, and the Classic Baseball Era Committee, which covers the years prior to 1980. While the committees got used to their new rotation, a big problem was brewing on the BBWAA ballot. The stars of baseball's steroid era of the 90s and 2000s were becoming eligible for the Hall of Fame, and writers were split on what to do with them. The 2013 ballot featured the debut of Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, 2 of the greatest players to ever play the game of baseball. Despite their incredible accomplishments, they received just 36.2% and 37.6% of the vote, respectively, because of their ties to performance-enhancing drugs. They weren't the only players linked to steroids on the 2013 ballot. Mark McGwire received 16.9% of the vote, Sammy Sosa received 12.5% of the vote, and Rafael Palmeiro received 8.8% of the vote. There were also suspected steroid users on the ballot, like Jeff Bagwell and Mike Piazza. Even though there was no proof of wrongdoing by these players, some voters were still apprehensive to support them. And then there was Curt Schilling. Schilling never had ties to PEDs, but the writers didn't like him because, simply put, he was a jerk. The result was a logjam, reminiscent of the first few years of BBWAA voting. Bonds, Clemens, Schilling, McGwire, Sosa, and Palmeiro were too polarizing to ever get in via the writer's ballot, but they still got a significant amount of support from voters who either didn't care about their steroid use, or abrasiveness in Schilling's case, or thought that their accomplishments outweighed their flaws. Those that continued to vote for Bonds and Company year after year were prevented from voting for players that they otherwise would have, due to the 10-vote limit. In 2013, Kenny Lofton fell off the ballot after receiving just 3.2% of the vote in his first year of eligibility. This is a shame, as Lofton belongs in the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. But take a look at this ballot. There are 14 or 15 players on this list whose statistical case is just as strong or even stronger than Lofton's. And then there's also Jack Morris, who got 67.7% of the vote for some reason. He won over 250 games. Don't look at his 3.90 ERA and 105 ERA plus, though. Oh, and he was great in the 1991 World Series. Don't look at the 1992 World Series, though. In 2014, the ballot was even more stacked, with 4 incredibly strong newcomers receiving a combined 1,674 votes, plus newcomer Jeff Kent receiving 87 votes as well. Many of the players that were on the 2013 ballot actually received a smaller share of the vote in 2014 than they had the previous year. This isn't normally how it works. Usually players get more support the longer they stay on the ballot. Rafael Palmeiro, who was one of only 4 players in MLB history at the time to reach both 3,000 hits and 500 home runs, actually fell off the ballot after receiving only 4.4% of the vote. And then there was 2015. How are you supposed to vote for only 10 players here? How is someone like Edgar Martinez or Larry Walker supposed to make any kind of progress with this competition? A change prior to the 2015 vote did help to alleviate this a bit. Instead of 15 years of eligibility, players now only had 10 years on the ballot. The benefit of this change was that the players responsible for clogging the ballot would be removed sooner than expected. Indeed, the 2016 ballot would be Mark McGwire's last, as it was his 10th year of eligibility and he received only 12.3% of the vote. Those who were voting for McGwire every year could now use that vote on other players. This was not an immediate solution, of course. It would still take a number of years to fully clear up. And there were casualties along the way. In 2015, Carlos Delgado, who hit 473 home runs during his career, was removed from the ballot after receiving only 3.8% of the vote in his first year. In 2016, Alan Trammell failed to make the Hall of Fame in his final year of eligibility, and Jim Edmonds fell off the ballot in his first year of eligibility, as he received only 2.5% of the vote. Lee Smith would be the next victim, as he failed to reach 75% in his final year on the ballot in 2017. Smith peaked at 50.6% of the vote in 2012, but he received only 34.2% of the vote in his final year, as his former supporters prioritized other candidates. Again, this is not normal. A player's final year on the ballot is almost always the year that he receives the most votes. The logjam was beginning to clear up, as a lot of players were elected by the writers from 2014 to 2018, and a lot of players that were receiving a decent share of the vote had their eligibility expire. However, a new wave of steroid-linked players were coming. Manny Ramirez debuted on the ballot in 2017, Andy Pettitte joined in 2019, and Alex Rodriguez became eligible for the first time in 2022. The candidates weren't out of the clear yet. Johan Santana became a casualty of a stacked ballot in 2018, when he received only 2.4% of the vote in his first year, and Lance Berkman was a victim in 2019, receiving only 1.2% in year number 1. Although Alex Rodriguez became eligible in 2022, the second era of oversaturated BBWAA ballots had effectively reached its conclusion, as Bonds, Clemens, Schilling, and Sosa failed to reach 75% of the vote and fell off the ballot in 2022. Now, it's up to the Contemporary Baseball Era Committee. For most of its history, the correct move for the Veterans Committee probably would have been to elect no one. Its purpose was to be a failsafe, to catch the deserving players that slipped by the writers. But with few deserving players to catch, members of the committee mostly selected players based on name recognition, cronyism, and the feeling that they had to pick someone. But now, there are an abundance of players that at least deserve consideration. It's time for the Contemporary Baseball Committee to fulfill its intended purpose. This section of the video was originally supposed to be a brief summary of how the election process changed over time and how the different iterations of the system led to problems. And then I ended up writing 16 pages, not because I wanted to, but because the system was so broken in so many different ways for the entire existence of the Hall of Fame. Now that we know what the problems were, how those problems were solved, and how those solutions led to even more problems, let's take a look at the outcomes. As mentioned before, there are currently 251 members of the Hall of Fame that were inducted as players, excluding those that primarily played in the Negro Leagues, and excluding the two players Carlos Beltran and Andruw Jones that are probably going to be elected by the time this video comes out. The reason why I'm opting not to discuss the Negro League Hall of Famers is not because I don't think they belong. I definitely do think that Negro League stars should be in the Hall of Fame. I'm choosing not to discuss them in this video for the same reason that I'm choosing not to discuss Hall of Fame managers, executives, pioneers, and umpires. It's simply harder to make objective, empirical judgments about these categories of inductees. For Negro League players, the difficulty arises from the fact that we don't have complete records of their games and stats, as many of the games that they played were exhibitions rather than league games. There's also discussions to be had about the level of competition in these non-league games and how much weight, if any, they should hold. The bottom line is that I'm not an expert on the history of the Negro Leagues, I do not have a lot of information to work with, and I therefore don't feel comfortable making Hall of Fame judgments about Negro League players. Obviously guys like Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Turkey Stearns, Oscar Charleston, Willie Wells, Bullet Rogan, like these guys clearly deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, but as far as some of the more fringe players, I don't have enough information to make a clear decision. Of the 251 non-Negro League players in the Hall of Fame, 137 were elected by the BBWAA, 112 were elected by one of the many iterations of the Veterans Committee, and 2 were elected via a special election. The BBWAA generally did a pretty good job. Of the players put into the Hall of Fame by the BBWAA, only 29 of them had a career R-WAR below 60, excluding relief pitchers. I choose 60 R-WAR as a benchmark here not because I think WAR is the deciding factor in Hall of Fame worthiness, but because 60 R-WAR has naturally become a bit of a boundary for Hall of Fame inclusion. There are 196 players with at least 60 career R-WAR. 142 of them are in the Hall of Fame. Of the 54 players with at least 60 R-WAR that are not in the Hall of Fame, 30 of them are either active players, players that retired within the past 5 years and are not yet eligible, players that are still on the writer's ballot, players with links to performance-enhancing drugs, players with character issues that have kept them out of the Hall, or players that were banned from baseball. That leaves only 24 players with 60+ R-WAR that do not currently have a plaque in Cooperstown purely because the voters did not deem them worthy. Excluding players with the conditions listed previously, 73.3% of players with between 60 and 69.9 R-WAR are in the Hall of Fame. By contrast, only 43.8% of players with between 50 and 59.9 R-WAR are in the Hall of Fame. again excluding active players and players with any of the other conditions listed before. Essentially, if you're a player with at least 60 career RWAR, you are likely to make the Hall of Fame, unless there's a reason for voters to want to keep you out. If you're a player with fewer than 60 career RWAR, you are unlikely to make the Hall of Fame, unless there was something special about your career that stands out to voters, or you were teammates with Frankie Frisch. The overwhelming majority of Hall of Fame elections were held prior to the advent of WAR, of course. Voters weren't thinking about WAR until the past 15 years or so, but the place that they drew the line throughout decades of voting just so happened to be right around the 60 WAR mark. Anyway, excluding relief pitchers, only 29 out of 129 players sent to Cooperstown by the BBWAA were worth fewer than 60 RWAR during their careers, and only 12 were worth fewer than 50 RWAR. Pie Traynor is the only non-relief pitcher with fewer than 40 career RWAR to be elected to the Hall of Fame by the writers. Overall, the writers have historically had high standards, and they've done a good job of sticking to those standards. If you recall though, the major issue with the BBWAA elections that caused the Hall to constantly tweak the process was not that their standards were low and that they were letting too many players in, but rather that they didn't elect enough players, at least in the Hall's mind. Let's take a look at the players that the writers did not elect over the years. Of the hundreds and hundreds of players that the writers had the chance to vote on over the past 89 years, only 32 players with 60 plus RWAR, and only 8 players with 70 plus RWAR, excluding players with PED, cheating, or character issues, have gone through their entire period of eligibility on the writer's ballot without being elected. Oh, would you look who's at the top of the list? What a surprise. Not all 32 of these players are necessarily snubs either. There are definitely valid arguments that the writers were correct not to elect some of these players. Again, 60 RWAR does not mean that a player is automatically Hall-worthy. It's just a quick benchmark that I'm using to get an approximate assessment of the BBWAA's performance. And overall, I think the BBWAA deserves high marks. Sure, they elected a few players that I personally don't believe are Hall of Fame caliber, and they certainly overlooked a few players that deserve a plaque, but a few mistakes are bound to happen throughout 89 years of voting. I also don't exactly agree with the way they handled the steroid era players, but I'll talk more about that later. Overall though, the BBWAA has done a pretty remarkable job establishing high standards for the Hall of Fame and sticking to those standards. It turns out when you allow a large number of writers who come from different areas and cover different teams to vote, and you require at least 75% of them to agree on a candidate, you generally get fair, high-quality results. And the reason why it's okay for the BBWAA to have high standards and to occasionally overlook a player or two is because the Veterans Committee and its cousins are there as a backup plan. In theory, it's a great system. In practice, it's an absolute mess. Of the 111 non-relief pitcher players to be selected by the various committees, only 35 of them have a career RWAR above 60. Excluding relievers, 68.5% of the players that were put into the Hall of Fame by the Veterans Committee do not meet the 60 WAR benchmark. Additionally, 44 of them, or 40%, have a career RWAR below 50. To reiterate, WAR is not everything. It is completely possible for a player to be a deserving Hall of Famer with fewer than 60 WAR, or even fewer than 50 WAR, but it's a lot less likely compared to players with more than 60 WAR. The various committees have made some positive contributions to the Hall's membership. Although there have been a few omissions, the committees have generally done well with putting the stars of the 19th century into the Hall of Fame. They've also put in deserving players like Ron Santo, Johnny Mize, and Arky Vaughan, who the BBWAA failed to elect. The major problems are that they've put in too many players, and they didn't always have the best intentions when making selections. Unfortunately, these problems have caused the various committees to be net negatives. The Hall of Fame's issues aren't just about the quality of players that do and do not have plaques, though. The Hall of Fame has made it clear from the beginning that its intention is to honor individuals from all eras of professional baseball. It is my opinion that, in order to do that successfully, all eras should be represented somewhat equally. The number of Hall of Famers is obviously going to increase over time as the number of teams, and therefore the number of players, also increases. But the ratio of Hall of Famers per team should be roughly proportional throughout baseball history. That is not the case with the current Hall of Fame. Here is what the graph of Hall of Famers per team looks like in each decade, from the 1870s to the 2010s. In creating this graph, I counted a player as a representative of a decade if that player played at least 4 full-ish seasons in that decade. That large camel hump in the 1920s and 1930s is partially Frankie Frisch's fault, but he's not solely to blame. The Veterans Committee had a 20s bias before and after Frisch as well. The average number of players per team in a decade is right around 2. Not only are the 20s and 30s extremely overrepresented, but the 40s, 50s, and 60s are overrepresented as well, while all decades before the 1890s and after the 1960s are underrepresented. The Hall of Fame isn't just unbalanced in terms of when its members played, but also the positions that they played. If you believe that all positions are important to a team's success, then there should be roughly the same number of players at each position in the Hall of Fame. Instead, the graph of Hall of Famers by position looks like this. As for pitchers, it's a bit trickier. The 5-man pitching rotation has been standard since the 1970s, and this graph from Frank Vaccaro shows that most teams used either 4 or 5-man rotations starting in the 1910s. Teams used both 3 and 4-man rotations in the 1900s, 3-man rotations in the 1890s, 2-man rotations in the 1880s, and a single starting pitcher pitched most games for teams in the 1870s. So let's say that the average number of pitchers in a team's rotation throughout professional baseball history has been about 4. For every 1 starting shortstop or every 1 starting first baseman that a team had throughout MLB history, they have had 4 starting pitchers, on average, approximately. Therefore, if we want to maintain our proportional representation of positions in the Hall, there should be approximately 4 times as many starting pitchers as there are shortstops or first basemen or players of any other position on the diamond. Admittedly, I have no idea how to make DH representation proportional to other positions. The DH wasn't implemented until 1973 in the American League and 2022 in the National League. There are also very few players whose primary position has been DH. Many DHs played the field when they were younger, then transitioned to a DH spot as they got older. It's also hard to say if DH even counts as a position or not. For the sake of this exercise, I'm just going to ignore DH. Relief pitchers have technically always existed, and while there were a few prominent relief pitchers as early as the 1920s, the idea of a closer, whose entire job was to come into the game in the late innings to shut down opposing teams, wasn't really embraced until the 1970s. There is an argument to be made that relief pitchers don't belong in the Hall of Fame at all, since they pitch significantly fewer innings than starters and therefore have much less of an impact on the game and are less valuable than other players. But I don't agree with this argument, as I believe that the best players in all positions and roles deserve a spot in Cooperstown. That said, I don't really know what the proportion of relief pitchers to other positions should be. If we exclude the 9 relief pitchers and 3 DHs, we are left with 239 current Hall of Famers across 9 positions. Using the estimated average of 4 starting pitchers per team, a completely even distribution would mean 79.67 Hall of Fame starting pitchers and 19.92 Hall of Famers at each of the other 8 positions. Currently, starting pitchers, catchers, and third basemen are underrepresented by the Hall, while first basemen, shortstops, and right fielders are overrepresented. In addition to the Hall of Fame being unbalanced, it is also inconsistent. The biggest inconsistencies relate to how voters have handled cheaters, banned players, and players with character issues. Let's start with the latter first. It is pretty well known that the primary reason that Curt Schilling was not elected to the Hall of Fame by the BBWAA is because he's kind of a jerk, especially to journalists. I won't go into details here because it's not relevant to the point I'm trying to make. The fact of the matter is that there are plenty of individuals who weren't very good people, but do have a plaque in Cooperstown. Cap Anson, for example, was a notorious segregationist who threw a temper tantrum when his White Stockings were supposed to play against a team with a black man on it in 1884. He was one of the most influential voices in favor of establishing a color barrier in baseball. Yet, he is in the Hall of Fame. Tris Speaker was a member of the KKK. He is in the Hall of Fame. Kirby Puckett has an extensive list of domestic violence and sexual assault accusations. He is in the Hall of Fame. Roberto Alomar is actually banned from baseball due to his sexual misconduct against a female Blue Jays employee, but he is in the Hall of Fame. Now, you could say that Puckett's and Alomar's character issues only came to light after their induction, and that is true, but I think that actually illustrates one of the problems with taking off-the-field behavior into account. The voters don't know everything about these players. They don't know every aspect of their private life. They don't know about the thoughts, feelings, and opinions they hold within them. They don't know the things they have done in the past and covered up, and they don't know about the things that they will do in the future. There's no way for voters to be the morality police without being hypocritical. They simply don't have the requisite information to make accurate assessments of an individual's character. You may also be thinking that the group of people that elected Anson differed from the group of people that elected Speaker, which differed from the group that didn't elect Schilling, and you'd be correct about that. But that argument doesn't work when it comes to cheaters and PED users. As it stands right now, arguably the greatest hitter of all time, who holds the record for most career home runs and most home runs in a single season, is not in the Hall of Fame because of a connection to performance-enhancing drugs. A top 5 pitcher of all time, who holds the record for most Cy Young awards, is also not in the Hall of Fame because of a connection to performance-enhancing drugs. Yet there are multiple players who have been inducted into the Hall of Fame that are either rumored to or confirmed to have used performance-enhancing drugs during their careers. And some of them were voted in by these same people that did not vote in Bonds and Clemens. David Ortiz allegedly tested positive for a banned substance in 2003. He was elected to the Hall of Fame in 2022, his first year of eligibility on the BBWAA ballot. That same year, both Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens fell off the ballot after receiving 66% and 65.2% of the vote, respectively. Ivan Rodriguez has ties to PEDs, as Jose Canseco claims to have personally injected him with steroids. He was elected to the Hall of Fame by the writers in 2017, his first year of eligibility. That same year, on the same ballot, Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds received 54.1% and 53.8% of the vote, respectively. While the controversy over performance-enhancing drugs reached its apex during the steroid era of the 90s and 2000s, the use of banned substances to get an edge has a deep history in baseball that extends back way further than the 90s. Henry Aaron, Goose Gossage, and Mike Schmidt all admitted to abusing amphetamines to get a competitive advantage during their playing careers. All 3 of them are in the Hall of Fame. Willie Mays and Willie Stargell were both implicated as amphetamine users by teammates. A teammate of Mays testified in court that he had seen amphetamines in Mays' locker, and a teammate of Stargell's testified in court that Stargell had provided amphetamines to him. Mays and Stargell are both in the Hall of Fame. Babe Ruth and Mickey Mantle both allegedly suffered injuries or illness after taking experimental steroid and testosterone concoctions. Both Ruth and Mantle are in the Hall of Fame. All the way back in the 1880s, Pud Galvin used and vocally advocated for a testosterone elixir made from animal testicles. He is in the Hall of Fame. And breaking the rules to gain an advantage isn't limited to drugs, of course. Gaylord Perry was famous for his spitballs and admitted to frequently using illegal foreign substances on the ball when he pitched. Whitey Ford did the same. Both of them are in the Hall of Fame. And the 2017 Astros may have been inspired by Hall of Famer Hank Greenberg, who stationed people in the center field to steal signs and relay information to him while he was at bat. And these are just the guys we know about. Amphetamine use was rampant in baseball in the 1960s and 1970s. The steroid users of the 1990s and 2000s definitely exceed the few that we choose to vilify. I understand the desire to act noble and to state that cheaters shouldn't be allowed in the Hall of Fame, but there is simply no way to be consistent in that position. You'd have to remove the plaques of some of the greatest players to play the game. And even then, you wouldn't be keeping out all of the cheaters. You would only be keeping out the ones that got caught. And then there's the gamblers and the game fixers. Hall of Fame voters have been a bit more consistent in this regard. They chose not to elect Shoeless Joe Jackson or Eddie Seacott, both of whom were banned for their alleged involvement in conspiring with gamblers to throw the 1919 World Series, even though there was no rule preventing them from being inducted until 1991. The 1991 rule making banned players ineligible for the Hall of Fame was put in place to keep all-time hits leader Pete Rose out of the Hall, so voters weren't even given the option to consider his case. As we've already discussed though, Roberto Alomar is in the Hall, despite being banned from baseball. There are also multiple Hall of Fame members that were once banned from baseball, but later reinstated. Fergie Jenkins was banned from baseball for drug possession in 1980. He was later reinstated and was elected to the Hall of Fame by the BBWAA. Willie Mays was banned for baseball in 1980 for promoting gambling, and Mickey Mantle was banned from baseball in 1983 for the same reason. Both players were already members of the Hall of Fame when they were banned, and they were both reinstated in 1985. Earlier this year, MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred announced that players on baseball's permanent ineligibility list would now lose their ineligible status when they die, making them eligible for the Hall of Fame posthumously. This change came just 8 months after Pete Rose's death, further reinforcing the notion that the entire purpose of the rule was to spite him. We'll see how the committees decide to handle the cases of Rose, Jackson, Seacott, and others. All I ask for, though, is some consistency. You can't let some cheaters or assholes in, but keep others with equal or better careers out. And since it's impossible to identify every cheater and asshole, I say let them all in. The only way to be consistent is to judge the players based solely on their performances on the field. The motto of the Baseball Hall of Fame is preserving history, honoring excellence, connecting generations. I don't think it can be true to that motto so long as Bonds, Clemens, Rose, Jackson, and others are on the outside looking in. These players were historic. They were excellent. And in Bonds and Clemens' case, they represent the steroid era, an entire generation of baseball. There is one more area in which Hall of Fame voters have been inconsistent, and that is the application of the rule that mandates that an individual must have played 10 seasons in the major leagues to be inducted into the Hall of Fame as a player. Excluding Negro League players, this rule has been broken only once, when the Veterans Committee selected Addie Joss, who only played 9 big league seasons in 1978. Frankly, I don't think the rule should even exist. It was initially used as a way to limit the number of eligible players, but the introduction of the screening committee in 1968 made it obsolete, at least for the writer's ballot. Longevity is already a major factor in a player's Hall of Fame case, so most players would need to play 10 or more seasons anyway in order to warrant induction. But if a player is exceptional enough to have a Hall of Fame caliber resume in fewer than 10 seasons, why deny him the chance to be elected? Evidently, the Veterans Committee agreed in 1978 when they elected Joss. Why make exceptions to the rule when there's a player that shows that the rule is bad? Why not just get rid of the bad rule instead? My qualm with Joss's election actually has nothing to do with Joss. My qualm is that the rule was waived only for Joss. Again, I just want some consistency. My personal Hall of Fame addresses these issues. Its membership is more balanced, more consistent, and more talented than the real Hall of Fame. When I first started to assemble my Hall of Fame, I didn't have a clear idea of how many Hall of Famers I wanted to have. I established the cutoff where I thought it should be, and made decisions on a case-by-case basis for each player. I always thought of myself as a big Hall guy, since there are a lot of players currently outside of the Hall that I would advocate for. But I realized that I'm actually not a big Hall guy. I'm just a better Hall guy. In fact, excluding players that are active or not yet eligible, my personal Hall of Fame has 251 players in it, the exact same number as the current Hall of Fame. Actually, my Hall of Fame may even be slightly smaller than the real Hall of Fame. I have 4 players in my Hall that are members of the real Hall, but were not inducted as players, but rather as pioneers, executives, or managers. These 4 individuals do not count toward the real Hall's 251 number, but since they are already members of the Hall, it's not possible for them to be inducted again under the player category. There's a chance that some or all of them would have been inducted as players had they not already been inducted under a different category. I've also decided to add players that are not yet eligible to my Hall, as well as active players that I believe have already passed the threshold to be worthy of the Hall of Fame. My grand total, including players who are active or not yet eligible, is 275. The real Hall will likely mirror this number when the players that I've preemptively inducted become eligible. The quality of the players in my Hall is materially higher than the real Hall. Here you can see the average RWAR, JAWS, and RWAR per 162 games played among Hall of Famers at each position. For those unacquainted with JAWS, it's a Hall of Fame worthiness metric developed by Jay Jaffe that averages together a player's total RWAR with his RWAR from his top 7 seasons, in order to take into account both career value and peak value. The average WAR, JAWS, and WAR per 162 is higher in my Hall almost across the board, even though the total number of players is also higher at most positions, and even though my Hall includes players from the 1870s with fewer than 600 games played. And again, I want to repeat that WAR isn't everything, and it certainly is not the only thing I looked at when crafting this Hall over the past 2 years. But it is a useful way to get a quick idea of value, which is exactly what we're trying to do here. Instead of a decades graph that looks like this, my Hall of Fame's decades graph looks like this. It's still not perfectly even, but there are reasons for the small spikes and dips, and they have nothing to do with committee biases or cronyism. Representation is low in the 1870s because it was the dawn of professional baseball. The other decades benefit from players that debuted prior to that decade, but also played at least 4 full-ish seasons in that decade. For example, Babe Ruth starred primarily in the 1920s, but he also played 6 seasons in the 1930s, so he counts as a representative of the 30s as well. The 1870s don't have any players like this. Professional baseball being in its infancy also caused players to not stick around for very long. The game wasn't bringing in tons of revenue like it does now, and players weren't paid very well. In 1871, Cap Anson was paid $66 per month to play for the Rockford Forest Cities. He was only paid for 6 months, however. He was not paid during the offseason. His annual earnings from baseball in 1871 were $400, which is roughly equivalent to $10,622 in today's money. His contract also forbade him from drinking alcohol or using curse words, and it required him to practice for at least 2.5 hours every day. While Anson's 1871 contract doesn't mention it, it was also common at the time for players to be required to purchase their own baseball uniforms and pay for their own lodging during road trips. As they got older, many players left baseball to get a job that would actually pay the bills. For example, Al Spalding was one of the best players of the 1870s, but he retired at just 27 years old as he learned that selling sports equipment was a far more lucrative career. Additionally, seasons were much shorter in the 1870s. Short seasons and short careers made it impossible for players to accumulate the type of counting stats that we're accustomed to, and that we would consider Hall of Fame caliber. The spike in the 1890s is due to a dramatic decrease in the number of major league teams compared to the 1880s and 1900s. In the 1880s, there was an average of 15.9 major league teams per year. There were 2 major leagues for most of the decade, as the American Association was established in 1882. And then, of course, there was 1884. For more information about what happened in 1884, check out these 3 videos. Yes, I have 3 separate videos discussing one season of baseball. The American Association folded after the 1891 season, however, and the National League was the only major league for most of the 1890s. For this reason, the average number of teams per season is only 13.8 that decade. In 1901, the American League was founded, and there were 2 major leagues for the rest of the 1900s, resulting in an average of 15.2 teams per season in the decade. The 1890s had significantly fewer teams than the decades immediately preceding and immediately succeeding it. But many of the stars of the 1890s also played in either the 1880s or the 1900s. Therefore, this spike is not due to a higher number of Hall of Fame players in the 1890s, but to a fewer number of teams existing compared to the surrounding decades. The dip in the 1910s is due to the same phenomenon, but in reverse. A third major league, called the Federal League, existed for 2 seasons in 1914 and 1915. As a result, there was an average of 17.6 teams per season in the 1910s, compared to only 15.2 teams in the 1900s and 16 teams in the 1920s. The higher number of teams caused the number of Hall of Famers per team to be lower. You may also notice that the 60s through 2000s have slightly more Hall of Fame players per team than the decades prior to 1960. This is because of the rise of the relief pitcher in the 60s and 70s. If we remove the relievers, we can see that the distribution becomes more even. Instead of a positions graph that looks like this, my Hall of Fame's positions graph looks like this. Again, it's not perfectly even. Right field in particular is still overrepresented, but it's much more balanced than the current Hall of Fame. Starting pitchers are also more fairly represented by my Hall than by the actual Hall. My Hall of Fame does not have a 10-season rule. If I believe that a player was able to put together a Hall of Fame career in fewer than 10 seasons, then I put him in my Hall. And, of course, I made my decisions strictly based on performance on the field and contributions to the game of baseball as a player. I didn't give players bonus points for serving as a manager, broadcaster, executive, or in any other roles after the end of their playing career. I didn't give any consideration to whether or not the player used illicit methods to gain a competitive advantage. I didn't take into account the player's personality or off-field activity. And I did not factor in if the player has been banned from baseball, whether it be for gambling, throwing games, or any other reason. As mentioned before, this is the only way to be consistent. With all that being said, I am proud to announce the Hall of Excellence. I will announce the players in approximate order of how certain I am of their belonging. I will start with players that I consider to be no-doubters. If you exclude any of these players from your Hall, then there's no point in having a Hall at all. Kid Nichols, Cy Young, Christy Mathewson, Nap Lajoie, Honus Wagner, Walter Johnson, Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker, Grover Alexander, Eddie Collins, Babe Ruth, Rogers Hornsby, Lou Gehrig, Lefty Grove, Jimmy Fox, Mel Ott, Ted Williams, Stan Musial, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Henry Aaron, Frank Robinson, Joe Morgan, Tom Seaver, Mike Schmidt, Ricky Henderson, Greg Maddux, Randy Johnson, Albert Pujols. The next group of inductees are players that some people may object to depending on their criteria and standards, but I am 100% certain in my decision to put them in my Hall of Excellence. Old Hoss Radbourn, Tim Keefe, John Clarkson, Cap Anson, Roger Connor, Billy Hamilton, Ed Delahanty, Dan Bruthers, George Davis, Eddie Plank, Sam Crawford, Shoeless Joe Jackson, Frank Home Run Baker, Harry Heilman, Charlie Gehringer, Al Simmons, Paul Wainer, Archie Vaughn, Luke Appling, Joe DiMaggio, Johnny Mize, Jackie Robinson, Bob Feller, Duke Snyder, Warren Spahn, Yogi Berra, Robin Roberts, Eddie Matthews, Ernie Banks, Roberto Clemente, Hoyt Wilhelm, Al Kaline, Ron Santo, Bob Gibson, Brooks Robinson, Willie McCovey, Carl Yastrzemski, Gaylord Perry, Fergie Jenkins, Johnny Bench, Jim Palmer, Rod Carew, Pete Rose, Phil Necro, Reggie Jackson, Steve Carlton, Burt Blyleven, Gary Carter, George Brett, Robin Yount, Nolan Ryan, Carlton Fisk, Ryan Sandberg, Paul Molitor, Dennis Eckersley, Wade Boggs, Cal Ripken Jr., Tony Gwynn, Mark McGuire, Jeff Bagwell, Larry Walker, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Curt Schilling, Mike Piazza, Mike Messina, Tom Glavine, Frank Thomas, Pedro Martinez, John Smoltz, Ken Griffey Jr., Trevor Hoffman, Billy Wagner, Manny Ramirez, Ivan Rodriguez, Chipper Jones, Jim Tomei, Roy Halladay, Mariano Rivera, Derek Jeter, Alex Rodriguez, Carlos Beltran, Adrian Beltre, Ichiro Suzuki, Miguel Cabrera, Clayton Kershaw. This next group of players are players that I am less than 100% certain about. I will list these players in approximate order of certainty, starting with the highest level of certainty. The On the Fence-O-meter shows my level of confidence, with 50 being the cutoff to make the Hall. Please keep in mind, by the way, that these groups are not tiers. They reflect my confidence, not the ability of the players. Al Spalding, Tommy Bond, Pud Galvin, John Ward, Bill Dolan, Fred Clark, Ed Walsh, Frankie Frisch, Gabby Hartnett, Carl Hubble, Ted Lyons, Bill Dickey, Lou Boudreau, Hal Newhouser, Don Drysdale, Harmon Killebrew, Bobby Grich, Don Sutton, Rich Goose Gossage, Dave Winfield, Ozzie Smith, Eddie Murray, Tim Raines, Barry Larkin, Edgar Martinez, Roberto Alomar, Rafael Palmeiro, Sammy Sosa, Scott Rowland, Robinson Cano, Zach Greinke, Jim McCormick, Amos Russi, Bobby Wallace, Stan Kovaleski, Mickey Cochran, Goose Goslin, Joe Cronin, Sandy Koufax, Juan Marichal, Lou Whitaker, Alan Trammell, Kevin Brown, Craig Biggio, Andrew Jones, Joe Mauer, Joey Votto, Ross Barnes, Mickey Welch, Buck Ewing, Hank Greenberg, Pee Wee Reese, Greg Nettles, Andre Dawson, Kenny Lofton, Deacon White, Jack Glasscock, Vic Willis, Clark Griffith, Dazzy Vance, Gary Sheffield, Todd Helton, Chase Utley, Bob Caruthers, Jesse Burkett, Richie Ashburn, Billy Williams, Dick Allen, Joe Torre, Louis Tiant, Lee Smith, Vladimir Guerrero, Joe Nathan, Buster Posey, King Kelly, Tony Mullane, Jim O'Rourke, Rue Waddell, Joe Gordon, Roy Campanella, Ken Boyer, Reggie Smith, Rick Rushell, Dwight Evans, Willie Randolph, Jim Edmonds, Jonathan Papelbon, Paul Hines, Mordecai Three Finger Brown, Zach Wheat, Red Ruffing, Larry Doby, Early Wynn, David Cohn, Jeff Kent, Francisco Rodriguez, C.C. Sabathia, Charlie Buffington, Joe McGinnity, Elmer Flick, Sherry McGee, Red Faber, Wes Farrell, Billy Herman, Thurman Munson, Willie Stargell, Ted Simmons, Buddy Bell, Johan Santana, David Ortiz, Addie Joss, Bill Terry, Dizzy Dean, Ralph Kiner, Whitey Ford, Gene Tennis, Brett Saberhagen, Yadier Molina, Jim Devlin, Cal McVeigh, George Wright, Bobby Matthews, Jim Whitney, Harry Stovey, Pete Browning, Bid McPhee, Sam Thompson, Jimmy Collins, Roger Bresnahan, Joe Tinker, Eddie Seacott, Urban Shocker, Max Carey, George Sisler, Eppa Rixey, Stan Hack, Joe Medwick, Bobby Doer, Jim Bunning, Minnie Minoso, Bruce Suter, Tommy John, Dan Quisenberry, Lance Berkman. Does it sound like high school graduation? The final group of players are active players that I believe are already deserving of the Hall of Excellence. If they were to retire today, their resumes are already impressive enough to warrant inclusion. Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer, Freddie Freeman, Chris Sale, Craig Kimbrell, Aroldis Chapman, Kenley Jansen, Mike Trout, Paul Goldschmidt, Manny Machado, Jose Ramirez, Nolan Arenado, Mookie Betts, Jacob deGrom, Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani. Of those 275 Hall of Excellence members that I just named, 189 of them are in the Hall of Fame as players, 4 of them are in the Hall of Fame under a different category, and 82 of them are new additions that are not in the Hall of Fame. Of those 82 new additions, 24 of them are either active or not yet eligible for the Hall of Fame, while the remaining 58 are eligible but have not been inducted. On the other hand, there are 62 players in the Hall of Fame that did not make the Hall of Excellence. I'm not going to name them all, but you can see them all listed on the screen right now. And I want to quickly acknowledge some honorable mentions. All the players that are scrolling down the screen right now have a 45 on the on-the-fence-o-meter. Most of these players were in the Hall of Excellence at some point during the process, and some of them I even flipped back and forth on multiple times. While they just barely missed the cutoff for me, I definitely would not object to any of these players being in the real Hall of Fame. And I may change my mind again in the future, who knows? The advantage that the Hall of Excellence has over the Hall of Fame is that I can add and remove players from my hall at any point if I feel that something needs to be tweaked. Which brings up an important question. Since the real Hall of Fame has never and likely will never remove players from its membership, what should be done to fix the real Hall? Well, if players cannot be removed, then the only way to fix the imbalance and inconsistency is to make the Hall bigger. There are multiple players that did not make my Hall of Excellence, such as Bobby Abreu, Andy Pettitte, Charlie Bennett, Sal Bando, Dave Stieb, Orel Hershiser, Keith Hernandez, and others, that I would vote into the real Hall of Fame. It may not be feasible for all other decades to catch up to the 20s and 30s without watering down the Hall completely, but I do think an effort should be made to boost the number of players from underrepresented decades, such as the 1870s, 1880s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. Unfortunately, the current committee system is not conducive to this. Instead of using 1980 as the dividing line, I would like to see the eras of baseball broken up into 7 sections. The 19th century, the dead ball era, the pre-war era, the post-war era, the pre-steroid era, the steroid era, and the modern era. Obviously, I don't expect the Hall to adopt these names, since I doubt they want to refer to war and steroids, but they can come up with fancy names for the eras. I don't really care. Instead of the steroid era, call it the slugger era, or the big strong boy era, or something. The reason why I would like more committees with narrower scopes is that the committees responsible for underrepresented time periods can vote more frequently, and the committees responsible for overrepresented time periods can vote less frequently. I would have the 19th century committee and the pre-steroid era committee vote every other year until the number of Hall of Fame players per team from the 1870s, 1880s, 1970s, and 1980s starts to catch up to the 1900s, 1910s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. The steroid era committee and the modern era committee could vote every 3 years. These eras are underrepresented, but there are still players from these eras on the BBWAA ballot. The dead ball era committee could vote every 5 years, the post-war era committee could vote every 7 years, and the pre-war era committee could vote every 10 years. As time passes and more players are added to the Hall, these voting intervals can be adjusted to better support the eras that need the most attention. In addition, I would like to see a higher number of candidates included on the committee ballots. Remove the opportunity for the Historical Overview Committee to sway the vote toward 1 or 2 players by putting them up against weak competition. Instead of 8 candidates on the era committee ballots, I would like to see 20 candidates. Let the voters have a real choice. And for the love of God, please put a larger number of voters on these era committees, like 30 at the absolute minimum. No more opportunities for cronyism. Anyway, going back to the Hall of Excellence, I'm sure some of you may be curious about my thought process for certain players, and as much as I would love to explain how I came to my conclusion for each and every player, I don't want this video to be 20 hours long. However, if you are interested in my reasoning for why I chose to include or exclude certain players, you may want to consider becoming a member on YouTube or on Patreon, as I plan to make some short videos discussing the Hall of Fame cases for some individual players. These videos will only be available to YouTube members and Patreon supporters, and I will take requests from the members on which players to make videos about. A huge thank you to everyone that sat through the entire hour and a half or 2 hours or however long this video ended up being. You could have spent that time watching like a big budget Hollywood film, but instead you spent it watching my video, which I really appreciate. I hope you're satisfied with your decision. Thank you all, and I'll see you all next time.